Yes.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this new webinar of the EU Payment Observatory. My name is Antonella Correra. I'm the legal policy officer in charge of the implementation of the current Late Payment Directive and the ongoing revision of the Late Payment Directive, the proposal for a new late payment regulation. We are here today to present the results of the report that we published at the end of October of this year on payment practices under the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. That is the first wave of those companies that were under that fall within the scope of the reporting. With all the developments that were ongoing while this report was being written and also afterwards, it might look that this report might be a little bit out of place, but actually, as you will see, actually not. We believe that this contains very interesting data per se, the data that is produced from that we can extract from these reports, but also from the experience that has been gained by the companies that have been reporting on the at least on the payment practices. And overall, I think we will have a very good discussion and insight on is it really worthwhile reporting sustainability reporting, and especially on payment practices. And we will know more about this, especially in view of new developments that are still needed in this area. For example, the need to develop a new standard for the companies between 250 and 1,000 employees, which are now in a little bit in between. So in the future, there is still a lot of work to do in this area. Before I leave the floor, I just want to give you a little presentation of our program today. We will have Agustina Korenbild, our researcher in CEPS. She will present the overview and of the report with its main highlights and the main contents and data. And then I will leave the floor to Bea in her capable hands. She's our project manager for the European Payment Observatory from the CEPS side. And the two very important speakers that we have today. Thank you very much for being with us today. Chiara Del Prete from EFRAG and Lina Whitaker from Eurocommerce. Thank you very much for being with us today. So before I leave the floor to I would like also take the opportunity to make an important announcement. Today, we publish the annual report 2025 of the EU Payment Observatory. It's available online, lots of data, lots of information. And I think it really, with the information that you will gain today from the webinar, I think it's also to go and look at the results of the report. So without any further ado, thank you again for your attention. Thank you again to our speakers and to the CEPS team for this meeting. And I leave the floor now to Agustina. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Antonella. I hope you hear me well. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen so we can start with the presentation. Can you see it? I guess so, just in case. Okay, so thank you all for joining this webinar. My name is Agustina Korenblit. I'm a researcher at the Financial Markets and Institutions Unit at CEPS. Today I'll be presenting our thematic report on payment practices reporting under the CSRD as part of the EU Payment Observatory initiative. So to start with a brief introduction, currently there's limited data on the EU companies' payment behavior. Also, the data that is available is often unreliable because it is based on small survey samples. As a result, it is difficult today to get a clear picture of the late payment situation in the EU, which affects every sector and every type of company, in a negative way, but in particularly SMEs. With the CSRD, that is the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, is the first reporting requirement at EU level to introduce and to include payment practices disclosures. With such, we expect it brings more transparency to payment performance among EU companies to generate data on payments available that is consistent and comparable, and also potentially help reducing late payments and improving the EU payment culture. So with the original CSRD, and I highlight original because there were some modifications we will see later, it requires companies to report on payment practices following the European Sustainability Reporting Standards as developed by EFRAG. So here I make a parenthesis to tell you how we structure our thematic report. So first we started identifying which are the standards that are linked to payment practices. Then we explore other national reporting requirements on payment practices inside the EU and outside the EU. And in third place, we conducted a pilot project on the first wave of CSRD reports published in 2025 to see first if companies are reporting on these standards and how they are reporting. So going back to the ESRS linked to payment practices, first the ESRS are divided between topical standards and cross-cutting standards. Cross-cutting standards are of mandatory disclosure, while topical standards that complement the cross-cutting standards are subject to the key innovation of the CSRD, that is a double materiality assessment, in which companies need to disclose and need to provide information and report on a topic only if they consider it material. So on payment practices in particular, we identified under the topical standards, especially under G1 business conduct, two disclosure requirements that are G1.2, that is management of relationship with suppliers, and G1.6 on payment practices. G1.2 requires mostly companies to provide qualitative data on the company's relationship with its suppliers, and among other elements, it requires companies to provide a description on the late payments practices or policies in place to prevent late payments, especially in relation to SMEs. And G1.6 requires mostly quantitative data on payment practices such as average payment times, standard payment terms to suppliers, number of legal proceedings related to late payments, etc. Under the cross-cutting standards, we have identified GOV3, that is integration of sustainability-related performance in incentive schemes, where companies who include payment performance in the management, administrative, and supervisory bodies' incentive schemes have to report on it. So with the European Commission Omnibus package, it is expected to be a reduction by 90% on the obliged entities in the scope of the CSRD. Also, the European Commission asked for technical advice to EFRAG to simplify the ESRS. And a few days ago, EFRAG announced the simplification that, among other things, it entails simplification on the materiality assessment, elimination of mandatory data points by 61%, and the reduction in need for direct data collection in the value chain. Especially on the payment practices requirement that we just saw, we identified that under G1.2, the description of policies to prevent late payments, especially to SMEs, was removed. And under G1.6, the average payment times at consolidated level was also removed. So here, as I was telling before, we explore other reporting requirements linked to payment practices in the EU member states, and we identify 4 countries. These are France, Poland, Spain, and Sweden, who introduced this kind of disclosures. So in all cases, this is for large companies. However, in each of these countries, the definition of large company differs. Also, the data that is required differs. As an example, the average payment period to suppliers is required in Spain and in Sweden. This is not the case in France and Poland. And also, the format in which the information should be reported differs. While in France and Spain, it should be done in the annual report, it should be included there, such as in the CSRD. In Poland and Sweden, this information should be reported through a government portal. Outside the EU, we identified 2 countries, the UK and Australia, who introduced reporting obligations targeting, in particular, late payment practices. Some differences with the CSRD, in both cases, more comprehensive, they are required more data points. Also, the frequency of reporting is every 6 months, compared to the CSRD that is on an annual basis. For companies in scope, the reporting is mandatory. Also, there are sanctions in case of non-reporting. The reporting, such as we saw for Poland and Sweden, is done via government portals. And also in both cases, they designated an enforcement authority to ensure compliance. So on the basis of analyzing how these reporting requirements in these countries impacted companies and also external stakeholders, we consider that the CSRD could actually impact both reporting companies and external stakeholders in a different way. So for the reporting companies, we consider that it could enhance internal awareness of own payment practices. It could also facilitate benchmarking with similar companies, and it could also increase management and governance bodies accountability. On this, the evidence suggests, especially in the UK, there are studies who found that half of the large companies under the scope of the UK rules actually changed payment procedures after the payment disclosures, and also payment statistics shows that they were worse than expected. So also another motivation to change payment procedures. The CSRD could also have a negative impact on the administrative burden of companies, especially for companies that are big groups with many subsidiaries, also for those who are already subject to other national requirements. For instance, implementing invoicing, which could ensure an effective and an efficient payment monitoring, has a cost. However, we think that that cost could be partially offset by the introduction of different requirements, such as the VITA package, that in 2030 will introduce real-time digital reporting for B2B invoicing, but also other national requirements on invoicing that will be introduced before 2030. On external stakeholders, we think that having payment data under the CSRD could be useful to have data to select business clients and to negotiate better payment terms. It could also reinforce enforcement mechanisms against late payers, and it could also have some reputational effects where companies that pay better would be rewarded. So we go now to the assessment, the pilot project that we conducted. So first, 2025 marks the first year where obliged entities have to report on the CSRD. On this first wave, the companies under scope are large companies with 500 employees or more that were previously subject to the non-financial reporting directive. So our population starts with these non-financial reporting directed companies, and we randomly selected 136 early CSRD reports from all companies in all EU member states, as you can see in the figure. And the objective of this is to evaluate first if companies reported under these standards that we mentioned before related to payment practices and how they reported. Also, these companies belong to different sectors, as you can see also in the figure. Most of them belong to manufacturing and also financial and insurance activities, which is expected given that they are in general large companies. So going to the main findings, first, all CSRD reports assessed contain a double materiality assessment as part of their sustainability reporting practices. And 92 CSRD reports, this is 68%, consider at least one of the non-mandatory standards linked to payment practices, as we saw before, G12 and G16, to be material for the organization, therefore reporting on them. Particularly under G16 on payment practices, we found that 67 CSRD reports, this is 49%, consider it to be material, and 53 reports, this is almost 80% of those who consider it material, indicated the average payment times at consolidated level, which ranged from 4 to 109 days on average. As you can see in the figure, most of the companies reported an average payment time in between 30 to 60 days, following to up to 30 days. Another element under G16 on payment practices is the standard payment terms to suppliers. In this case, we found 55 reports. This is 82% of those who deem it material to disclose this. where the main factors determining the different standard payment terms are the supplier sector first, then the country or market of the supplier, and finally the size of the supplier, for instance, whether it's an SME or not. Another element is the percentage of payments aligned with standard payment terms. In this case, we found 37 reports, 55% of those who deemed it material to disclose this, which ranged from 49% to 100%. And finally, the number of legal proceedings for late payments, we found that 61 reports, so 91% of those who deemed it material, include this, with 55 CSRD reports indicating having 0 legal cases, and the remaining ones ranging from 1 in Poland to 95 legal cases in France. We go now to the other disclosure requirement, G12, management of relationship with suppliers. In this case, we found that 91 reports, this is 67%, consider it material for the organization. As you can see in the figure, there are certain sectors such as construction, transporting, and storage, for who this disclosure requirement is material for all of them or for the majority of them. We know from the EU Payment Observatory these are usually sectors very affected for because of late payment. The fact that they reported a high degree of materiality is also telling us something. Then we have 45 reports, almost 50% of those who deem it G12 material, indicated having policies or practices in place to prevent late payments. In this case, we found that timely settlement of invoices was the first type of practice. Then use of digital tools. This includes, for instance, having invoicing or having SAP in place. And lastly, we found a structured payment process to ensure setting invoices on time. Also, we only found 4 CSRD reports with shorter payment times for SMEs, and then only 2 companies who reported having charging interest for late payments. Then under the mandatory requirement GOV3, integration of sustainability-related performance in incentive schemes. In this case, we found that 90% of the sample CSRD reports included. However, in none of the cases, payment performance was reported to be part of the management, administrative, and supervisory bodies' incentive schemes. Some final conclusions on the assessment. We found that a significant number of companies reported on payment practices and consider it material. Also, that the sectors most affected by late payments show comparatively more firms reporting on it. This is the case, for instance, for the transport sector and also for construction. However, we found a high degree of heterogeneity in format and structure. For instance, for the quantitative data, there are some companies who provided the data in a tabular form, while others do it in text, which limits the overall utility and comparability for users. And finally, with the omnibus simplification, the reduction in scope, plus elimination of certain disclosure requirements, we think this could limit the potential benefits that we saw at the beginning of the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Agustina, for a presentation that I think also maybe I'm a little bit biased that was very interesting, and also it's very good as a scene setter for the discussion that we are going to have right now with Lina, who is Director of Competitiveness for Eurocommerce, and with Chiara Del Prete, who is the EFRAG Sustainability Reporting Technical Expert Group Chair. But before we start with that, I want to say a little bit of housekeeping. I saw that there is some hands raised and some participants that want to ask questions. Please do so through the Q&A button, and then there will be some times at the end to address them. So entering into the discussion, I think the best thing that we can do here is start with Chiara, because Chiara represents EFRAG, and as Agustina said, EFRAGs are the ones that are in charge of developing the European Sustainability Reporting Standards. And they presented just a few days ago, I think it was the 5th of December, the the new simplified technical standards. So I think it would be good to start with that. Maybe, Chiara, you can explain us a little bit what is the reasoning behind this simplification of the European sustainability reporting standards on payment practices, what happened behind the scenes, how did the process take place?
Thanks a lot, and it's a pleasure to be here today. I need to say that we looked with a lot of interest at the findings of this report, which were very timely for our process also. So we started with this mandate of simplification in March. There was a clear expectation of a significant reduction in the reporting burden. And so what we did is to look for deletions of data points and simplifications that could satisfy this objective, but at the same time would allow to maintain the original core objectives, because the CSRD has not changed for what concerns the topics to be covered, nor for the type of information to be covered. So it has been a very difficult exercise, always conducted in a multi-stakeholder environment, where from the one side we had the preparers, but from the other side we also had the users and the investors and civil society and the regulators also involved. Now, when we look specifically at the exposure draft and how payment practices were treated there, we already had a difficulty in finding an agreement on the simplifications in the exposure draft. And that's the reason why we had a specific question in the consultation investigating whether the proposal was appropriate, or whether the elimination of the reference to SMEs would be so disruptive that we would fail the objective of the CSRD. So we need to see the exposure draft as an intermediate step in this process. And what we heard from the consultation was a mixed feedback. So from one side, there was a clear message from companies that currently the information about the sides of the counterpart, so the sides of the supplier, is not something that is systematically stored in their IT systems. So producing even the qualitative information, not to mention the quantitative, would be for them impossible unless they had to implement a specific flag in their IT systems that allowed to identify which payments were specifically related to the SMEs. At the same time, the feedback also confirmed that for users, the practice currently is not comparable. So a bit the same feedback that we saw in the report presented just now. Now, if we move to the final outcome of the standard, I am pretty satisfied about the result, despite it being a compromise. So first, you need to consider that the new standards are much more principle-based than the previous one. So a series of detailed data points have been eliminated without impairing the coverage of that topic, because we moved to a more principle-based approach. And how it is working for this specific topic. First of all, we have included in the list of topics to be covered, Appendix A to ESRS 1, a specific mention to management of relationships with suppliers, including specifically the late payments for SMEs. Now, this is much stronger than what we had before, because before in the list of topics, we only had management of relationships and supply practices, but there was no mention of SMEs. Now, if you know how the system works, in a double materiality, you look at these issues specifically in the appendix. And so now SME is specifically recognized as an aspect of a topic that needs to be covered if material. First. Second point, we integrated G1 into the general system of policies, actions, and targets. So while we eliminated the disclosure, the narrative on the practices, this comes at the same time with bringing G1 into the general system, where you have in ESRS 2 the general disclosure requirements. Therefore, if that topic, management of relationships, specifically SMEs, is material, then there is a shall, it's a requirement, shall report its policies, actions, and targets. And there is a minimum content in ESRS to be applied. So also in this case, you don't see the specificity in the topical standard, but nevertheless, on a principle-based, we have not reduced the obligations. So it is still well covered. Final point I want to mention, the metric. We discussed very lengthily about a metric that would be at the same time relevant and feasible. And considering the ambition of the simplification and the expectations, we could not get support for the idea of mandating the disclosure of the percentage of late payments specifically for SMEs. For that aspect of not imposing companies to have this IT flag on SMEs on all their payments. But at the same time, we have included an application requirement that emphasizes that when SME is a material topic according to the double materiality, using this Appendix A that I mentioned at the beginning, in that case, it shall be covered by an entity-specific metric. What does it mean? It means that we expect this to be covered, but companies to use whatever they have currently to cover it. This may result in some lack of comparability at the beginning, but I consider it a first step to maintain the focus on the topic. It was not a consensual decision. In the tag, we had a dissent for not having a standardized metric, but in the tag, in the board, we also had reservations because what we kept was still too demanding in order, in terms of specification for SMEs. So I hope you appreciate that we had to navigate different point of views, and this was the best possible compromise. But I would insist that I don't think we have reduced significantly the coverage. If anything, we have reinforced the principle-based aspect of it.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I understand that it's very much more left right now to the own assessment of the companies that have to say, okay, this in with regards to, for instance, the qualitative part, we think that this is relevant for us. However, without the explicit mention with payment practices. On this latest point, a follow-up question that immediately came to mind is because, of course, what you kept is the payment terms and then the percentage of invoices that are kept within those payment terms. Wouldn't that require the same system than the payment times, than the one for monitoring payment times, which is probably an invoicing system?
So in terms of explicit requirement, we have the description of the standard payment terms, and only if those terms are different for SMEs compared to the other suppliers, a specification in narrative terms. Then the percentage of late payments that are aligned with this standard term is not specific to SMEs. So the paragraph now 17b and also C with the legal proceedings, they are not specifically related to SMEs. What is specifically related to SMEs is the entity-specific metric, non-standardized metric. So if SME is a material topic, the companies shall provide an entity-specific metric to measure the fairness of their late payments. So it is the entity specific that is tailored to SMEs in terms of metric. And that's where we will have a non-standardized answer in this phase.
Yeah, I understand that it's very difficult to target to SMEs. My question was more regarding the burden with regards to payment times and payment terms, but maybe this is more a question actually for preparers, and that's why I'm actually gonna go to Lina. Lina represents retailers. I think it's very good to have you here because you represent both big companies and SMEs. So you, in a way, represent both preparers and users. And let's start just with the preparer side. Many of your companies, or quite a few, were basically had to report under this first wave. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about your experience, about their experience, about how much burden this was, what did they think of the different data points, etc.
Thank you. And just so those who aren't that familiar with Eurocommerce, we are the representative association. So we represent both retail and wholesale at EU level. So we have a mix of the large and also the small. So we've had quite a little bit of experience just looking also at the positives that I read in the report. And I think it was interesting to read, and also as was explained earlier, that sectors that are most affected by late payments were the ones that reported most as well. So if I take what material means, it also means that companies are a little bit conscious that this is an important factor. So perhaps that's one very good positive that you can also take out of this report. And I think it also shows as well that there is some data that can be used from this. And if I listen to Chiara, some of this also will be transferred across even with the change, because if you're reporting on payment terms, then you get at least some impression of what it is as the parameters used in different sectors. So I think it's certainly very positive. But when I looked at the examples of what some of the companies in retail and wholesale have been able to prepare for the first wave as well, I think the positives that also came out of that was it gave a good description of what are the practices. It showed a level of commitment, and it also demonstrated the performance. So I think what was interesting is the practices. It looked into, okay, how is payment managed, whether this is by electronic means. It gave visibility on the actual type of payment term, and also could in some cases give a percentage of timely payments as well, an important factor to understand what is late payment and also what is just the payment term. And I think it also gave an opportunity for some companies to show their other commitments. So I read one where it had a link to other initiatives. So this might be in terms of just overall responsible purchasing practices, where one element was about respecting fair payment conditions. And so that gave an opportunity to showcase a little bit of what additionally could be happening, also in terms of whether a monitoring system had been set up, for example, that ensured through a schedule that you had prompt payment, or if there were third-party procedures. And I think also what was interesting was that some of the companies are also explaining, okay, there were no legal proceedings, they hadn't paid any arrears, and also whether there was inspections from enforcement authorities. So it does seem, first of all, that it does give quite a little bit of information. And I think some of the reports as well that I looked at showed that this was about ensuring that the value chain operates optimally, and also might just reflect a little bit of the relationship that exists in retail and wholesale. Many of the time it's continuous payments, long-term contracts, long-term relationships. So that might explain a little bit of the rhythms and the reasons for payments being arranged as they are. However, on the other hand, I think Maya, you asked a little bit about, okay, was it easy to do this? And actually, when we sort of spoke with members, I think it did seem to be very similar to what you've observed, is that payments and the systems are operating because that's how the business operates. It's not necessarily geared towards, okay, I now have a piece of legislation that requires me to respond specifically on what my policy is towards SMEs. And a lot of this is just practical. Um, Dealing with thousands of suppliers, it can often be quite difficult to find that overarching governance or standardizations. I think what our members explained is you can have purchasing departments that may be dealing with one particular area, and they have a level of autonomy that means that they also are organizing themselves according to that particular area. And the sheer volume that's in charge of this as well is, and putting a system in place that can then match what needs to be reported on is particularly challenging. I think I had one example that a food retailer that's operating one country could have something like 3,800 suppliers, and there will be negotiations taking place with larger companies that then have various other elements that may be taken into account on top of just agreeing what the payment term is. It may be items such as rebates, or it could be promotions, or various different aspects like that. And then you have a different type of supplier. You might have somebody who's actually working on a very local level. And all of these different elements mean that the business is operating to try and get that quantity and that different variety into a store, and then trying to standardize actually what's happening overall is quite a challenge. And I think that's part and parcel a little bit about the ecosystem that is there as well, because on one hand, it is payment terms, but it's also about, okay, what are we doing aside from this? It may be that there could be cash on delivery. It could be that a supplier is given certain money up front before they when they enter the contract, and all of the different elements as well that might be there that I think the observatory's talked about in terms of other things that are helping as part of the ecosystem, whether it's factoring, reverse factoring, and all those different systems in place. So it's fairly complicated, but overall, I think some of the data that you've got in your report, and also what I've seen as well from some of the reporting, is quite interesting to show that this transparency can bring something, even if in practice it's quite challenging.
Okay, very, very interesting also to know. I mean, the same thing that we saw in the UK, which is that basically it helps company know more about themselves and know more about the way they handle things, and also to know exactly, you said, what is a good payment and what's paying well and what's not paying well. So that was very, very, very interesting for us. Also, I mean, so I understand that it's particularly difficult to consolidate payment terms, no? So basically there are multiple, that's what you were hinting, that there are multiple payment terms and it's very difficult to pinpoint, okay, we just have 45 days payment terms or something like that. Am I correct?
Yes, I think, well, it's just a standard one because it depends on what you're buying. Is it perishable items? Then there may be legal requirements in that regard. If it's non-perishable, it's also depending on what those terms are as well. So it does matter in terms of what it is, who it is, how much it is, and all of these different parts. But if I saw also from your report, there was no business that had reported under the disclosure statements of having payment terms that were longer than 60 days.
There
Maybe
were
Agustina
a
can say
very
something
few.
there.
There were a very, very few. In general, they were, until 60 days. But there were maybe, I think it was outside, especially on suppliers in Asia that pay maybe at 90 days. I think the maximum was 90 days.
Thank you. Okay, so moving on. Well, actually, Antonella mentioned that we today published the annual report. And our annual report shows once again the pervasiveness of late payments across the EU. And I think it's clear that any tool that we can use to combat this, we should. And from what we saw for instance, in the UK, we can see that reporting can really help preventing late payments and promoting a good payment culture. So now, I mean, with, okay, the CSRD is closed, there are new sustainability standards, we see that there are less companies in scope, we see that maybe there are less data points that originally we thought there will be. But then, okay, there is also the possibility to have more voluntary reporting or other ways to promote this. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about this. Maybe, Chiara, what are your thoughts there?
Well, it's clear that this is a policy expectation, right? So as part of the omnibus proposal, when it was presented already by the Commission, and it's not changed in that respect with the agreement now in the trilogue, is that companies that are outside the scope are expected to report on a voluntary basis. Now, of course, this cannot be an obligation. That's obvious. It is a matter of having the right incentives for this to happen. And of course, those incentives can be measured in terms of financial opportunities. So in terms of better access to finance or better cost of capital. Traditionally, that's one of the reasons why companies are motivated to undertake the cost of disclosing. Now, of course, in this specific case, we are talking about an aspect that may not immediately be visible in terms of its financial materiality. So are investors asking for information about the payment terms at this point in time? Maybe they will be interested in the future. So this is something that we need to see. Certainly, we need to operate in a way that it becomes more clear what is the strategic value of disclosing a fair behavior and an appropriate practices, etc., on business conduct. So looking at the sustainability reporting as a strategic element of differentiation for the specific company. We have been working in this area last year as for the SMEs, for the voluntary standard on SMEs, which now constitutes the basis for the voluntary reporting also of larger companies. We still don't know what exactly based on will mean, meaning if the Commission will make adjustments to identify selective topics that are to be covered for these companies. I mean, it would just be speculation at this point in time. What we know is that it is based on VSME, so we cannot expect a level of sophistication significantly different. But there is an important point. The ESRS have been significantly simplified now. So I would really hope and expect that more and more companies with a level of sophistication significantly different than what can be served by our standard for the SMEs will think about applying ESRS or part of it on a voluntary basis. So that's where we collectively have to all work to emphasize on the benefits that can come from that level of transparency, in particular for companies that are significantly more complex than a company with less than 250 employees. So we are entering into a new dimension of the sustainability reporting, where we need to create the incentives for the voluntary reporting. And I would like to think that our simplified ESRS are sufficiently approachable by companies with, 500 plus employees to look at them on a voluntary basis.
Thank you very much. Indeed, I think that's probably how we have to think about it, and also very big companies which are very relevant for late payments, because as we have proven, the bigger the company, the most likely it is that it pays late. They are actually probably these sophisticated ones that have maybe already the systems to report on this. So I think in this area, this approach could really work. Also, I was thinking, I don't know if you have anything to say about the sectorial, because as Agustina presented, one of the main points that we found is that actually those sectors that are more concerned about late payments are the ones that are reporting more, which probably is pointing to a good materiality assessment being done.
Yes, certainly. Whenever we have dialogues with the users or companies on the remaining implementation challenges, one of the most frequent subjects, of course, is the need of sector guide for a more meaningful and more efficient reporting. While the omnibus in its final form has confirmed the elimination of the sector standards, there is a recital in the late omnibus text which points to the possibility for the Commission to develop non-mandatory guidance in this area. So this is one of the possible developments that we could see in the future.
Thank you very much. That does indeed seem like a potential very good approach. Now turning to Lina, because of course we were talking of you before, or your members before as preparers, but you have them also as users. We also talked about own accountability, but what about your members that are more SMEs? How is this for them? And how do you think also we could kind of promote more voluntary reporting?
Thank you. So I think on the side of sort of the ones that might be using this, we also have wholesalers, and predominantly they are SMEs. Similar to how the landscape of retail is, with the majority of the companies being SMEs. So I think, if I'm honest, they haven't referred to this in much detail, and maybe it is also because of the infancy and also the arrangements that they have in place. Is they usually are the ones that are offering longer payment terms to also help their customers in terms of actually managing their cash flow. But I think maybe what's interesting is if I can pick up on just what Chiara was saying about the right incentives. And I think there may be two here. I mean, one thing is certainly accountability. Reputation is very, very important for many companies, and particularly in consumer-facing relationships. Sort of, if information is out there, it is often looked at. And that also can have a negative impact. If something is found as a problem, it can be a newspaper headline. And this actually is a very strong incentive to ensure that what you put out publicly is actually what you're doing in practice, because there is always somebody ready to point out the faults. So maybe that is the incentive. It's an internal culture of reputation being everything. And then on the other hand, I was thinking as well that maybe some of the inspiration that could be gotten could also help. I looked at the report, and I think the report that is out there talks about how a Portuguese company in retail and wholesale was able to set its maximum payment terms below 30 days and actually was able to support SME producers in Portugal by having really that 10 days worth of payment terms. So if it is a little bit about the incentives, is this something, and we would have to have a look to see whether this actually made them more attractive or whether it was some other factor. But it could be something in terms of just that visibility that also inspires people to actually maybe think they could do the same. So I think there's quite a lot of visibility, accountability that definitely could help create those incentives. But I think it's still early in the day. And let's perhaps see if it develops also, as I think that Chiara says, it's not gone away, the responsibility to report, it's just come in a different format.
Yeah, indeed. I'm sorry that it's still too early, but what you said, repetition, is very, very interesting. And we had a few months ago in one of our webinars, precisely somebody from a UK basically platform that's what they did. They basically just promoted good payers, and that was a way to say, hey, these are good people we are seeing it in this report. These are good policies that maybe other people could imitate, and I think this has a tremendous value for this kind of reporting. And we hope that despite let's say good practices on payment practices not being explicitly mentioned in the ESRS right now, they still put it. I'm gonna go now for to the questions from the audience, because I'm seeing a question by Sofia Sakari from SME United, who is basically mentioning that well, several points. The first one is the relevance about the data and the number of legal proceedings, and then also simply about how it's reporting in itself a solution, or we also need other kind of stuff like stronger sanctions, enforcements, and rules. I mean, I have my personal opinion, but less maybe, I don't know if Lina or Chiara want to address any of this.
Yes, in general, I would say on the legal proceeding that there are no metrics alone that can inform without the necessary contextual information. So it needs to be taken together with the explanation of the management of what is at the origin of this number. Certainly, reporting alone, if there is a specific policy objective, may not be sufficient because it takes time. As also Lina was saying, incentives could be created by looking at good practices, but this takes time. While if there is a priority in terms of policy with other type of instruments or tools such as the fines, etc., or enforcement actions, that would be much more effective. We faced a contradiction, if you want, in our simplification work. From one side, there is a policy intended to protect SMEs and to promote more fair behavior in their respect. But at the same time, from the other side, we had to reduce the costs for reporting companies. So one of the interesting elements, if you see the covering letter that our board sent to the Commission accompanying the standards, one of the aspects is that we say, we emphasize the difficulties that we had to get consensus on a standardized metric. We point to the fact that we couldn't approve a set of standards with a standardized metric. And therefore, this is an aspect where we think that the Commission should look again, because specifically we wanted to point to this conflict between two opposing objectives, and we couldn't really do more than what we did, but as it was not satisfactory, this is an aspect where we put emphasis in our communication, public communication with the Commission. So I'm very much sympathetic with what Sophia is saying.
And maybe I can comment on the second part of the question then, because I think it's also important what Chiara says. One is there's a context, and two, I think it's also important to look at both sides of the story, that there is a supplier and there is also a buyer. So I know the survey that was looked at by DG Grow over the summer also examined maybe a little bit more from the supplier side. There was less questions also directed to the larger companies as well, to perhaps look at the situation that they faced. So, but I think it's also true. I think we can also agree that reporting is one element, enforcement is a second element, and there are many different things. I think in some of the reports that we looked at, they also suggested that mediation was something that could be useful, or it could be also trying to make sure a little bit more that we don't make payment unless we have the purchase order, because this just causes delays because the information's not there to do this. And again, awareness raising, and also things like the reputational levers. So all of these different elements, I think, are what needs to be taken into account. It's not really, I think, with this complexity and this desire to get a culture of prompt payment, it's very difficult to just target one thing that could really make the difference.
Yeah, I think there from the observatory, we fully agree. There is no solution that can help everything. We just need to have different tools and different ways to, at the end, ultimately just change the behavior, because that's what's gonna be the big game changer. Although I have to say that we also have a lot of hope on new technological advancements such as invoicing, which I think actually for this reporting would be extremely useful. Antonella, I think you have a point.
Yeah, I wanted to thank all the interventions. Chiara and Lina were very interesting and with lots of very useful insights. I just wanted also to pick up what Chiara was saying about what will come in the future and offering maybe the right incentives, maybe to those who want to report voluntarily, because it emerged very clearly also in the report that many companies reported voluntarily. There were some reports from member states that have not yet transposed the CSRD in its original format, and yet they decided to report. So it says a lot, it says something. The strategic context, I think, is very clear. The Late Payment Directive says very clearly the objective is to change the culture of payment and to promote a decisive shift towards a culture of prompt payment. And I think the way in which a company pays is very important. I was talking to companies last week, to entrepreneurs, and they say, you know what, when we go to fairs and we want to find new business partners, the first thing we ask is, do you know that company? Do you know whether it's a good payer? Because they really actively look for this information. Otherwise, I'm not going to start any new commercial partnership with a company that maybe in the rumor, in the business environment, is known to be a bad payer. Unfortunately, many companies don't have this luxury. There are many companies that either depend from the public sector or their business model does not allow to have many choices. But for those that can have a choice, having information about the payment practices of a company is extremely important. So maybe this is something that we will discuss also with our colleagues in DG FISMA, but it is something that where would be possible, at least voluntarily, of course, while remaining within the whole simplification purpose, but having something that makes it easier for those who want to report and maybe make a clear show of their good payment behavior. Why not? And also, I think it's as a business behavior, I think we should make it easier. So that's my observation. So thank you very much for all.
Indeed, thank you. And we are actually coming to the end of the webinar, but I don't know if Lina or Chiara want to say anything else, or if not...
Sorry if I interrupt. I see there is a hand raised.
Yes, but as I said, the question has to be asked from the Q&A. So, yeah. All right. I don't know if Lina and Chiara want to say anything or to finish, or
No,
not.
I'm very grateful for this exchange, and I think that it would be good to continue the conversation in the next phases for this delicate aspect of creating the right incentives.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. Lina?
And I think I also echo that. I think the conversation needs to be continued, and I think it's quite an interesting one to be had.
Indeed. And as we pointed out in the report, this is just the beginning. This is just the first wave, and let's see what happens in a few years. Maybe we'll have to do another report to see what's actually been the consequences of all this. Anyway, thank you very much to all. Thank you very much, particularly to Lina and Chiara for accepting to join us today, and to all the participants that were here. We will keep organizing webinars, so we'll keep you posted, and I'm gonna finish with a Merry Christmas because I know many people are about to get to go on holidays. So thank you very much all, and have a nice evening.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you also from my side. Thank you to all, and thank you to all the attendees. And thank you, grazie Chiara, and thank you, Lina. Bye.
Thank you. Bye bye.